Hi everyone, I'm Joe. It's nice to be here. And this is me. This is my Twitter header, which is a portrait of Vladimir Putin, which I photoshopped my head on top of. And then that's my face when I have to open up Xcode. And so I'm a student at Reading University. I study computer science. I'm in my placement year at the moment between second and third year. And during that placement year, I'm working at Fluid, which is an all-in-one collaboration platform for businesses. And I'm the lead mobile developer, and lead is in quotes because I'm the only mobile developer, so I'm not sure where that really leaves me, but anyway. This is React Native. So what is React Native? According to Facebook, React Native is an open source cross-platform solution. It was created by Facebook, and it is a way of making real native applications using JavaScript, using React concepts. So what do I mean by all these things? React Native, by real application, what I mean is that React Native is not a web view which has a wrapper which has access to native methods. It is actually a native application. It uses native components from the actual SDKs itself. So in theory, it should be indiscernible from an application that was written in Objective-C or Java. As I mentioned, it uses JavaScript, whether or not you like JavaScript. If you're here, you probably do, or maybe you don't. And that includes everything about JavaScript, good and bad. And you can also transpile to JavaScript using TypeScript. Flow comes out of the box, and things like Reason can offer you 100% type soundness with JavaScript. So that's React Native. So when React Native came out, a lot of people started saying this concept of write once, run everywhere existed. And that's what people were assuming was the goal of React Native, but it's actually not. What Facebook actually has said from the beginning is that React Native is a learn once, write everywhere framework. And so what do they mean by that? They mean that if you learn the concepts behind React, the lifecycle methods, then in theory you can apply that to not just things like the web with React.js, but also native applications like React Native, VR applications, and there's a little list a little bit later explaining some other platforms. And so with React Native at Fluid, our app was from the start written in React Native, and every time I have to make a feature change or a bug fix, I estimate it's about 95% code sharing between platforms. I tend to test it on iOS and then forget that I need to test it on Android, push it, and then it will crash. So you gotta, that 5% is usually an Android-related error, which I will get into in a little bit later. So these are some features I'm just gonna run through of React Native that you get. Hot reloading, things like just changing the color of a button does not mean that you need to rerun the whole application. You just can save your project, and hopefully in the packager it will reload and you see your change reflected and all your state should be kept intact, which is much nicer than doing an Xcode build every time that you change a font size. React Native also gives you this idea of piecemeal integration where you can take a native app and inside the actual Facebook app in the events page, that is a React Native page. So it's not just this idea of you can put a React Native page inside a native app, but what you could also do is put native things inside a React Native app. So it kind of works both ways around. UI layout in React Native is handled by Flexbox, which if you know the web, then you hopefully are quite comfortable with Flexbox. It tends to be as much Flexbox as the web is, but sometimes it's a little bit lacking behind. They only just recently added space evenly, for example, in Justify content. So I'll also mention how CSS is handled, styling with React as well in a little bit. The React Native community is also very good. I know it's not necessarily a feature, but I tend to find it's quite welcoming to new people. When I was starting out about a year ago now, I think there was a lot of really good content out there, some Medium articles and stuff, and on my last slide there's some places that you can find useful information. So developer experience before React Native. If you wanted an iOS and Android app, then you have multiple code bases which require multiple skill sets, either Swift Objective-C, Java, Kotlin, and even those Kotlin is fairly new, Swift is slightly less new, but those things are necessary if you wanted to do a native application before React Native, unless you wanted to do Xamarin, but I won't mention that. Tool chain as well. With native development, you have Xcode, which is its own thing that you have to manage, and Android Studio, where Google somehow took IntelliJ and made it slow. But so tooling in native wasn't so good. And also just the fact that big development teams, places like Deliveroo, for example, which are completely application-based, would need multiple large departments just to handle their native implementation for applications. So you could do this, or you could just have one application and get reviews like this on the App Store, well, on the Google Play Store, for example, where people don't like your application because you're not on iOS, and they borrow someone's phone to rate you poorly. So please don't do this, for the record. So now React Native has come about, and its life is better. You have one code base, more or less, depending on if you want to go specifically for platforms. So what you can do is you can specifically write, I want to do a .android.js file, and with that you could say, this is where all my Android logic goes, and the packager knows the correct way to navigate those kinds of situations. And also, I mentioned more or less because you could also base a web code base off of your React Native one, or vice versa. It's a single reusable skill set. Like I mentioned, web applications can be written in React. The paradigms are extremely, well, they are the same as React Native, so that's very nice to get. Any editor you want, any tooling you want, it's JavaScript. Use VS Code, which is what I use. Microsoft has really good tooling for React Native because Skype, the new Skype app is built in React Native. I don't know if people know that, but so VS Code is really good. Euclid is very good. That's what Facebook uses internally. And then you just have like your general IDEs, WebStorm, things like that. And this last point, one team across multiple platforms. So that's kind of me. I manage the iOS and Android applications on my own. New features, bug fixes. I don't have to go and code some Swift or go today, okay, today I'm going to code some Swift, today I'm going to code some Java. I just write it in JavaScript and it goes across. And then you also have this library from Sarah Vieira points out that there is a whole load of platforms that React can just plug into. And you can't expect that your React Native code works directly across, but there is a lot of shared logic, especially business logic, that can be transferred to things like VR applications. And there is a whole bunch of really cool ones. You can make presentations in React, and yeah, so that's worth checking out. So this is something not so good about React Native is the error messages are quite unfortunate. They don't tend to be too descriptive, and give it credit. Sometimes you do get one that says exactly what's wrong, but you may notice that 3 of these are Android error messages. That's not that I'm biased, but so the one on the far left is a Android specific one, which happens if you leave a trailing space that isn't inside a text view. Android doesn't like that. iOS is totally fine with it. You won't get a crash on iOS, but on Android that will cause an issue. And that's a hard one to find as well, and you've left a space somewhere. The second one is a native issue. Invariant violation is a bit nondescript, but it happens, or it used to happen, I think it's been fixed now, when you animate the opacity of an element. This was happening. And to give it credit, I know I've hid it behind that other error message, but it is actually giving a stack trace, which is pretty helpful. This third one's my favorite. I see this one quite regularly. It happens when I think what happens is that your service worker breaks, and it says this import scripts error. And to me, I've just translated that in my head now to mean I'll just turn the debugger off and then it will show you what the actual error is. It's a bit of a non-error. And that last one is just because React Native uses a bridge in order to communicate to the native platforms. That last one is saying there's some sort of problem with the bridge, so just restart it and hopefully you'll be okay. If you're not, then try clearing the cache in it. So some misconceptions about React Native. These come from back when it came out. Navigation is bad. This came about because there was a native implementation for navigation. However, it was specifically on iOS at the start. Then there was an experimental one, but it kind of got abandoned and now it's deprecated. And so this turns a lot of people off because it's a huge part of an application. Nowadays, it's not so bad. You have React Navigation, which is a really well-maintained project coming up to version 2 now. And it's being worked on a lot by the people at Expo who have a vested interest in React Navigation, and I'll mention them a bit more in a little bit. There's also a native navigation solution. So React Navigation is JavaScript purely, so Expo can use it. And a native solution actually uses the native navigators. So you can expect that to be, in general, a bit more performant. So another misconception that came around, this one used to be true anyway. Every release was a breaking change. They used to be breaking changes every 2 weeks. The React Native schedule was at the start, which is quite intense if you're trying to maintain a production application. This isn't true anymore. It's not so bad. The upgrade process got a lot better around the 0.4x's version. React Native is not a 1.0 framework. You are still using something that is quote-unquote beta. But it is significantly better now. You will see much less breaking changes, and they will not affect 100% of the developers. It will just be a small subset of people using specific modules, etc. And so the final misconception is one that's not just about React Native. It can be applied to any cross-platform framework, which is that making a native UI it's not possible. You have to use native code in order to make a native UI. So I took this, I expanded this misconception, and I found this online. This is someone's article just weighing up pros and cons of React Native, and he mentions this, which I found interesting. React Native isn't per se replacing native look and feel, but it is native look and feel. It uses the native button, it uses the native view. So using this, I thought I would play a little game. I know everyone loves audience participation, so we're going to evaluate 4 applications, and I want people to just raise their hands for each one if they think one is native. So, is Stack Overflow a native application? Who thinks it is? One person? 2 people? 2? Okay. Is GetPoint a native application? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A countable amount. So 7. More people think GetPoint is native. Okay. Is Airbnb a native application? Okay, people know this one. I thought they might, but is Parkopedia, if people know Parkopedia, is that a native application? No one? One person, great. So the answer is Stack Overflow is actually a native application, which is disappointing. It's not a very good one. GetPoint is React Native, and it works really nicely. Airbnb, obviously React Native, it's one of the most famous examples. I thought I would include it anyway. And Parkopedia is a native application. But this wasn't just a survey to determine, you can't tell. The point is to say that you can design a UI however you want. It's really up to the developer how native the look and feel of an application is. And so you can see, both of these applications have tab bars. They try and stick to the native concepts. The navigation headers are very, very similar. You've got a floating action button on Stack Overflow, but that can be recreated in JavaScript pretty easily. And with these two, it's more of an example of you can take your own custom UI and just make it look good. So Airbnb obviously put a load of work into their React Native application. They've been pushing it since it came about. And both of these applications have their own custom UI where you don't really need to look and feel native. You can just do whatever you want. So how do you get started writing React Native if you haven't already? These are 2 ways I'm going to show you. There are more ways, and obviously you have the option of integrating React Native into an already existing application. The React Native CLI is Facebook's original way of installing React Native to your machine, and Create React Native App is it's supposed to be an equivalence of Create React App, but for React Native. I will get into details and differences between both of them. I just wanted to show some input and output. So here is what happens when you run React Native init, just a project name, and this is some nice output you get. Pretty simple, basic. You just run iOS, that will start the packager for you, or you go inside Xcode and run, that also starts the packager. And Android, you run Android, and then if you don't have the emulator running, then it will give you an error saying you need the emulator running. So either plug in your phone or have that going. That takes 41 seconds, which I will get back to why that's relevant later. So create React Native app, you run the project name, and you get a much nicer output, a bit more beginner friendly, and it explains all the different scripts inside. It uses Yarn, there's an NPM issue with create React app and create React Native app, so they recommend that you use Yarn. And so create React Native app uses Expo, which offers a lot more native modules out of the box, things like video, which isn't supported out of the box from React Native. You get push notification support, some crash reporting with Sentry has an SDK, Facebook, even the Facebook SDK is on Expo, but it's not out of the box React Native. So Expo gives you a lot of benefits, and it also provides a much easier way of getting started with your actual real phone. You scan a QR code on Android, you used to be able to on iOS, but Apple don't like it anymore. So the iOS people, now you have to receive a text message, and it will run and build, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. This takes 1 minute and 8 seconds. I just wanted to point this out to say that you're not getting the most trimmed down version. You're getting something on top of this, and with Expo, you also do get a downside where if you wanted to use a native module that isn't supported out of the box, then you have to eject, which involves either some pain or not, depending on how many Expo modules you're trying to use. But it essentially takes your Expo project, turns it into a React Native project with your iOS and Android endpoints. And yeah, that's Expo eject means that you can install a native module you can't usually in Expo. So some React Native code. It's very similar to React if you've used React, which most people here have, I assume. You have your view instead of a div. You have your text instead of a span. And your styles are just JavaScript, JSON objects with just a CSS equivalence with property names and values. You use the style sheet API from React Native. It gives you a performance. It does a bit more performance improvements than just doing an inline style, but you can do an inline style. So that's React Native. And React code. So this is what happens when you run create React app. The previous slide is create React Native code. So, create React Native app code. This is what you get out of the box when you run create React Native app. And this is what you get when you run create React app. And it's there's a bit more to it. You have a header section, you have an image which spins because it's an SVG, and you have a title and some code formatting inside the p tag. So you may think that it's potentially not an equivalence for a starting point. So what I did was I just took that code that you get from create React app and I translated it over to React Native. So quite literally, the DOM elements that represent views have transformed into, DOM elements that represent an area have been transformed into views. And I had to get funky with the image because SVG support doesn't come out of the box with React Native, so I'm just doing a PNG and I'm animating it with the animated module, which I know Jamie is going to talk about in a bit. And the styles, you can see that you can add multiple styles, and that's actually how the animation works. And then I've got text. The view at the top represents a header area, and I didn't do the code formatting, but you could do that by importing a new font style. That's the way I think I would do it. And there's an inline style there as well, because that's totally fine. So this is so similar to the React code earlier. Why not just use this and try and make it work on web, which is what someone at Twitter Nicholas Gallagher did. He made a library called React Native Web, which sounds a bit ridiculous because the whole point of React Native is to take React and do it natively. Why are you doing it the other way around? But it actually does make a lot of sense because React Native comes with a lot of things that when you do web projects, you have to add separately. For one, you have to use CSS, and with React Native, you don't. You just learn the JavaScript object. And if you do the wrong CSS in JavaScript, even though it's a string, it will tell you inside the packager what the correct options are for that specific part. So so React Native Web looks like this, actually. Actually, it is this. This is React Native Web code. And this is from my React Native Web starter library. You can just get running with it. This compiles for web and for native apps. So it uses create React Native app for native and create React app for web. So what does that look like? This is me making a change to the word hello. And you can see that I saved my file in a different window. It compiles the change. It happened on iPhone X there first, and then it goes to the Firefox tab in the background. And this, on the left, I just want to emphasize that that is actually a native application. It is not a website being run inside a browser. So that it works really well, and I encourage checking it out. My library has a TypeScript branch, navigation branch, including native navigation. So if the important animations that you get that you're used to in your native applications, you can have that, and the normal React router API that you're used to with React. So that's quite nice. And so this goes to the whole idea of, well, React doesn't need these two separate entities. You need React JS and React Native. If it's learn once, write anywhere, you shouldn't need to learn two pretty similar things and write it anywhere. And in the replies, you can see that the React framework itself replied saying that they can't fault Paul Young's logic here. And then you have a reply from this guy, Shift Reduce Conflict. This is Jordan Walk, who invented React, saying that's kind of the plan. And it should have pluggable rendering backends, which it is getting to. If you look at that repo that I addressed earlier with the awesome React platforms, then you'll see where that can be applied to. So just to sum up, React Native is native, cross-platform, JavaScript, React, and it's millennial speak good. So thank you very much. That's a link to the slides. These are some resources I thought were pretty good, and I used them as well. And that's my social information if anyone wants to stalk me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was brilliant. Has anybody got any questions? Do you want to take questions?
Yeah, sure.
Has anyone got any questions for Joe?
Hello.
Hello. So a lot of the appeal, obviously, especially to the management kind of team, would be you only really need one set of developers to create an app.
Mm-hmm.
From what I've heard, occasionally it ends up needing three, where you need a React developer, Android developer, and an iOS developer.
Yeah.
And obviously, in your company, that's probably not the case, but do you foresee that being an issue?
It really does depend on what type of application you're making. So for example, I was reading a blog post on the Twitch Medium page where they were talking about how they wanted to implement all of the Twitch features with React Native. And he was an Android engineer, and he was talking about how he was finding he had to go back into Android code more often than not. And so with Twitch, you have all these native things like a live stream and a live chat component, which maybe are more suited to a native app developer. So it depends on your project a lot. So for Fluid, it's a lot of API requests and data to read. There's a chat, but it's fairly simple to implement, Signal stream, etc. So it really does depend on your project.
Great. Anybody else? Any other questions? No. Cool.
I think someone at the back may have had a question.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's an appropriate question, but I'm running Linux, so no Xcode for me. Thank you. I'm running Linux, and no Xcode for me. When I try to build things in React Native, I there's this huge long build process, which is fine because I've got a computer that builds it for me. But somewhere along the line, the computer tends to get stuck on something, and then I end up with build errors from Gradle in Java, which I know nothing about. Is that just always going to happen? Is there any way around that?
So is that when you're initiating a project from the start?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the long build time, that usually happens when it's the first time that you're running the project or something similar to that. It can go on for quite a while, more than 2 minutes even. But after that, it should build a lot faster, especially on Android. I find Android tends to be faster at building than Xcode. With Gradle issues, though, I guess it really depends on what the Gradle issue is. I've had like multi-dex issues where you have to go in and change the manifest, and that's just a case of me going on Stack Overflow every time I see one of those and seeing if I can fix it. But on Linux, it should be fine.
Is there any difference in the speed of the app running afterwards?
So you mean compared to a native application? Yeah. So for speed, there is a minor. It actually depends. There's a very thorough article, which maybe I should have included here, but it goes into an evaluation between different areas, different types of applications, so like signing into a Facebook page and making a to-do list. And in certain areas, React Native perform better than native, and in certain areas, native perform better than React Native. So it like I said earlier, it depends. GPU-intensive tasks seem to perform better natively, and then things like making a to-do list item and updating UI tended to perform frames per second better on React Native. So it does depend how you use React Native, though, because you can write the code badly and then it performs slowly. So.
And is there a difference in the size of the app at the end of it?
Yes, there is actually. That's a good question. With Android, there is no JavaScript engine that can compile your React Native code. So actually, every React Native app needs to come bundled with this JavaScript core. And that does increase the APK size. I think if you do a React Native init project, then I think it comes out about 6 megabytes. I could be wrong. But then you've got things like ProGuard to minify your application, which hopefully reduces it quite a bit. Fluid is about 30 megabytes, and that's a full production app that we use. And it's quite a lot of pages. iOS, you don't have that problem, because JavaScript core is bundled inside the it's a part of the native SDK. So, yeah, that it?
Great. Thank you very much.